right, good morning, everyone. It's good to see so many friends. I also see some enemies in the back. I'm Luis Simon. I'm the director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy, CSDS, at VUB. So welcome to this fourth edition of our Brussels-Korea Forum, which I think has become a referent by now in the Brussels think tank and policy circuit on all things Korea and beyond, and all things in the Pacific as well. And a special welcome to all those of you coming from Korea. Thank you for being here with us. So last year marked the 60th anniversary of the EU-Korea, EU-ROK relationship. And that anniversary theme had sort of like a prominent place in our 2023 Brussels-Korea Forum. This year, of course, we're going to continue to pay much attention to the EU-ROK relationship, reflecting specifically perhaps on how the new political cycle here in Brussels may impinge on the EU's approach towards the Indo-Pacific region, as well as the EU-ROK relationship. But we're also going to touch on NATO, not least in light of the ongoing strengthening of NATO-ROK relations. Ambassador, you're here, and the priority afforded by the ROK government to this particular file, as you know. This is in fact very close to our heart at CSDS, as it connects to one of our flagship initiatives, Bridging Allies, which sort of seeks to generate ideas to strengthen practical cooperation between what we refer to as the core alliances of the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific regions. Now, as you surely know, the war in Ukraine sort of continues to dominate, to filter most discussions on foreign and security policy here in Brussels. It has been doing that for the past few years. And as you also know, the war not only underscores the growing interconnectivity between Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and people have been talking about this at length over the past few years, but also more specifically, I would say, the growing interconnectivity between European security and Korea Peninsula dynamics. As you know, North Korea has provided Russia with more munitions than any other country. And of course, there is no such thing as free munitions. And Russia's down payment to North Korea comes by way of support of Pyongyang's missile and nuclear programs, and therefore fuels regional instability in the Korean Peninsula. Then on the flip side of the story, South Korea, as we know, continues to stand behind Ukraine, much like other like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan or Australia. But perhaps more importantly, I would say, Seoul's arms exports to Europe, particularly Poland, perhaps, are both directly contributing to strengthening deterrence and security in the NATO area and in the Eastern European flank, and indirectly bolstering Ukraine in the sense that they're helping backfill Polish own arms transfers to Ukraine. In fact, I would say that the deepening of the ROK-Polish relationship, which I think is also illustrated by recent projects on co-production, is probably one of the most concrete and strategically meaningful examples of cross-regional defense cooperation between the NATO and Indo-Pacific alliance ecosystems. And I think shows the way forward as we continue to think about how to sort of put meat on the bone of cross-regional cooperation. And I think that even if NATO and NATO's Indo-Pacific partners will continue to focus operationally on their respective regions and neighborhoods, we have now entered a stage in which we are reflecting together about how to develop a sort of cross-theater ecosystem of shared concepts, doctrines, technologies, capabilities, and standards that gives us that generates synergies and gives us the scale required to outmatch our respective competitors, especially in the context of attrition and protraction. And Kurt Campbell was alluding to this just a few months ago. And I think the ROK actually is one of the most advanced in this respect and stands out in the context of this strategic puzzle. So we've got with that by way of introduction, we've got an exciting program today. My dear friend, Ambassador Ryu, who is, of course, South Korea's ambassador to Belgium, the EU, and NATO, is going to kick us off in just a couple of minutes. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you, Ambassador, to you and your team and your government for your friendship and support. Of course, also a special thanks to the Korea Foundation for their support of our center and of our Korea chair specifically throughout the years and their partnership. After the ambassadors kick off, we're going to have two panels. The first one is going to focus on the Europe-Korea relationship as it relates to Indo-Pacific and global security. And in the second panel, we're going to zoom in on economic security and technology cooperation, of course, always as it relates to cross-regional and more specifically Europe-Korea. After that, our Korea chair, Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo, will offer some concluding remarks. By the way, this month we mark the 7th year since we established our Korea chair, which we are, of course, very proud of. I think that's it from my side, but not without thanking, of course, Ramon, the Korea chair team, our head of activities, Natalia Martin, and the entire CSDS job for putting this event together, and all of you for coming. That's it for me. Enjoy the forum. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rui. Good morning, dear colleagues. 안녕하십니까? Excellencies, distinguished members of panel, and ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to join you today at the Bristol Korea Forum 2024. Let me begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to my friend Dr. Ramon Pacheco Pardo, the KFVUB chair at the Center for Security Diplomacy and Strategy, for hosting this significant event. My special thanks also go to my friend Lee Simon and your team for your hard work in bringing us together today. I'd like to extend my appreciation to all the panelists, particularly those who have traveled from Korea, for sharing your invaluable insights on how we can further strengthen Korea-EU relations. All in all, we are especially honored by the presence of former Korean Foreign Minister and also my former boss, His Excellency Dr. Yoon Young-kwan. Dear colleagues, this year marks, as my friends mentioned before, a pivotal moment for Europe. In June, we witnessed the election of 720 new members to the European Parliament, and soon new leadership at the European Commission, Council, and the External Action Service will take office. The EU's path of integration remain a beacon of cooperation and unity, exemplifying how diverse nations can join forces for collective prosperity and stability. The European Union has also been setting the standard for global regulations, a phenomenon so-called Brussels effect, where multinational companies adopt EU rules to access its vast market. This is a testament to the EU's immense soft power and ability to shape global standards. I'm confident under the new leadership, the European Union will continue to thrive, setting the stage for a prosperous future. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, we are living in an era of unprecedented global challenges and geopolitical complexities. The ongoing wars in Ukraine and Sudan, along with the escalating conflict in the Middle East, have created immense uncertainty. Simultaneously, we are witnessing increased military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, further complicating the global security landscape. In this context, it is critical than ever for Europe to deepen its engagement with other regions, including Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific is not only central to global economic growth, but also holds strategic significance. Ensuring stability and security in this region is essential for protecting global supply chains, safeguarding freedom of navigation, and fostering inclusive cooperative relations. As for Korea, we are fully committed to enhancing our strong partnership with the European Union. For 3 consecutive years, our bilateral trade volumes had steadily increased, and the EU remains Korea's largest investor. This collaboration now extends beyond the realm of trade and investment to encompass security and defense and innovation. In line with our commitment, Korea is devoted to expanding our cooperation with the European Union to uphold universal values of maintain a rule-based international order. As the Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol mentioned before, he has emphasized Korea is dedicated to contributing to global peace and prosperity under our vision of becoming global pivotal state. In support of this goal, Korea has increased its official development assistance by 30% this year, and as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, will continue to play a constructive and responsible role in promoting global security and prosperity. Excellencies and dear colleagues, today's forum offers a valuable platform for exploring new avenues to deepen the Korea-EU partnership. As the Korean ambassador to the European Union, I am fully committed to further promoting and enhancing our relationship in the years to come. Once again, I thank you all for being here and contributing your valuable perspectives to this important dialogue. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for that fantastic introduction. It seems like we are ahead of schedule, which is very, very good news. It gives us a bit more time for a discussion, and given that we have 4 speakers, I will not have to rush them. So welcome to this first panel on Europe-ROK cooperation in Indo-Pacific and global security. That's our title. So the idea here is to sort of try and situate the Europe-Korea relationship in the context of a rapidly changing and increasingly volatile, as the ambassador was mentioning, geopolitical environment. Now, all of us in this room can probably agree that the relationship between Korea and Europe, and the ambassador was alluding to this, is rock solid, as I like to say. And that's not a cliche in the sense that the proliferation of conflicts from Ukraine to the Middle East, and also including those military buildups that the ambassador was mentioning in the Indo-Pacific region, sort of compels us to think about how to reconcile, and I'm thinking here from a European and an ROK perspective, the reality of having to make hard choices about allocating our limited attention and resources from a national security perspective, with the need to stand up in favor of global norms and principles whenever and wherever they are challenged, even if it's not in your immediate neighborhood or in your immediate corner. While also, of course, recognizing the fact, again, as the ambassador was saying, that security dynamics in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Indo-Pacific are increasingly intertwined. And I would say that the war in Ukraine sort of appears to have catalyzed the consolidation of two sets of adversarial alignments, which some people are, that's the concept some people are using. On the one hand, we have with what some people refer to as the axis of upheaval or axis of revisionism, structured around an increasingly meaningful relationship between Russia and China, but also comprising a series of interlocking partnerships that include the DPRK and also to some extent Iran. And of course, there are frictions within this grouping. I'm not sure we can call it a coherent, it's not a coherent bloc. There are frictions, and Russia will certainly continue to worry about mitigating its own dependence on China and continue to strengthen its own ties with the DPRK and some of the things that Russia is doing with the DPRK, China doesn't necessarily like, with Vietnam, even with India and so on. And also on the other side of the story, North Korea, Iran will also try to maneuver between China and Russia to maximize their own leverage. So this is by no means a coherent bloc, but I would say that a key takeaway, at least from the war in Iran, we'll talk about the Middle East later, which is a bit more complicated, is that what unites these revisionist powers is significantly greater than what divides them. In the sense, and in particular, a shared interest in sort of rolling back US power and pushing back against the open, rules-based international order appears to be animating a growing geopolitical alignment amongst these revisionist powers, especially around the key regions of Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific. And then on the other hand, you've got these efforts to strengthen ties between the United States and its European and Indo-Pacific allies. And of course, the main game here is intra-regional, the revitalization of NATO and the transatlantic relationship on our side of the world, and the revitalization of the US-ROK alliance, the US-Japan alliance, and then growing minilateral cooperation as well, such as the Camp David agreements were a very good illustration of that. But then there's also this dynamic of increasing cross-regional, cross-theater cooperation between the two let's say, alliance architectures. So I think that's the broader context, so to speak. And we're here to try and get a better sense of how the ROK-Europe relationship fits specifically in this broader geopolitical context. And I think to do that, we've got a terrific lineup here today. So in my immediate left, Minister Yoon is the chairman of the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies, which is a leading think tank, not only in South Korea, but I would say in the region and indeed globally. And he has had a distinguished career trajectory of public service, as well as in academia and in the think tank world. Most notably, of course, having served as South Korea's foreign minister, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade between 2003 and 2004. Then to his left, we've got Elena Lazarou, who's a senior policy analyst at EPRS in the European Parliament and also a fellow with Chatham House. Then we have Sok Sang-hoon, who is KF Indo-Pacific Fellow at RUSI in London, and has also served in the South Korean Foreign Ministry for several years, until quite recently, in fact. And then, of course, to the far left, which I don't know if that's where he belongs, but he's to my far left. our very own Ramon Pacheco Pardo, who holds the Korea chair at CSDS and is also a professor at King's College London. So we've got 90 minutes, roughly. Each speaker is going to start with a 10-minute sort of kickoff, give or take. And after that, we'll open the floor for any questions or comments you may have. Just to remind you that this is a public event, so everything you say will be used against you. So, Minister, let's maybe start with you. You served as foreign minister and have been advising Korean governments, successive Korean governments, for 30 years or more. So why don't you kick us off with an assessment of how the ROK's foreign and security policy outlook, and perhaps more specifically the relationship with Europe, has evolved during this time. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Louis Simmons. It is my great pleasure and privilege to speak at this Brussels Korea Forum 2024. And I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Louis Simmons and Professor Ramon Pacheco Pardo for the invitation. Also to Ambassador Yu Jong-yan for his excellent service to strengthen ties between South Korea and European Union. I think the relationship between South Korea and Europe has undergone significant evolution since 1963, when South Korea established diplomatic relations with European Economic Community. Over the several decades since 1963, our relationship has expanded through three distinct phases, in my view. First, the Cold War period, the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. During this period, Korea was primarily focused on economic development, a strong alliance with the United States, and a liberal international order provided Korea with a very favorable external environment for pursuing the goal of economic growth. As a result, the main focus of South Korea's relations with Europe at the time was centered on expanding trade and investments. The second phase was the early post-Cold War period, 1990s. The end of Cold War allowed South Korea to diversify its foreign policy while normalizing diplomatic relations with former adversaries such as the Soviet Union and China. South Korea sought to strengthen its strategic ties with Europe. For instance, South Korea explored partnership with NATO to address shared security challenge. In 1994, South Korea joined NATO's Partnership for Peace program, which enabled intelligence sharing and joint military exercise and collaboration on other security issues. The third phase was post-Cold War period, since 2000s up to now. During this phase, South Korea adopted a more proactive stance on global issues such as climate change, human rights, or developmental issues through collaboration with Europe. South Korea signed the Paris Agreement, for example, in 2015, and has partnered with EU on developmental projects in Asia and Africa. During my tenure as foreign minister in 2003 and 2004, under Roh Moo-hyun administration, I engaged in discussions with many European counterparts discussing how we can cooperate in denuclearizing North Korea through diplomacy. And the Nomuyan administration at that time actively participated in multilateral frameworks such as Asia-Europe meeting. In summary, our relationship has developed from mainly economic partnership to economic and security partnership, and finally to economic, security, and global partnership, a kind of comprehensive partnership. And European Union has become South Korea's third largest trading partner, and South Korea is the only country that European Union concluded comprehensive agreements covering all the three pillars of economic, political, and security affairs. Nowadays, over 40 consultation bodies are operating between EU and South Korea. However, South Korea and EU now face serious challenges amid a time of great turbulence. The rise of authoritarian state and the weakening rules-based international order, and the realization that security is indivisible, all these point to the need for us to upgrade our cooperation to a new level. Now, let me turn to South Korea's diplomacy. I'd like to explain what drivers are behind current administration's external strategy. First, intensifying US-China confrontation. It's a kind of China factor. The second is weakening rules-based international order, Russia factor, and serious security stress from North Korea factor. Since around a global financial crisis in 2008, the Chinese leaders began to adopt a more assertive policy toward North Korea. Even in that kind of situation, President Barack Obama didn't give up America's engagement policy toward China. However, his successor, President Donald Trump, was different. He shifted American policy from engagement to confrontation. The problem for South Korea was that it had been adopting a strategy which relied on the United States for security and China for economic prosperity. And the intensifying competition or confrontation between the United States and China made it impossible to separate economic matters from security consideration. So that was a big challenge, and President Yoon Suk-yeol, his administration has shifted toward aligning more closely with the United States and Japan. I think it was a kind of natural choice because Korea's identity as a democratic country and North Korea's persistent security threat. And his administration adopted a more ambitious strategy, such as positioning South Korea as a global pivotal state and focusing on the Indo-Pacific region as the central stage for South Korea's diplomacy. So this is the first driver for South Korea's external strategy. The second one is Russia factor, mainly weakening rules-based international order. South Korea's rapid economic growth and democratization were made possible in large part by the existence of a rules-based international order. As a relatively small country surrounded by big military powers, South Korea continues to depend on a strong and effectively working rules-based international system. This is why South Korea joined international sanctions on Russia and provided aid to Ukraine recently. A Russian victory in Ukraine would have serious negative implications for South Korea's security. It would signal to North Korea and China that the US and the West lack the resolve and capacity to uphold the rules-based international order, which will probably make both leaders in China and North Korea more provocative and bolder. Finally, serious security stress from North Korea, a North Korea factor. Following the failure of the 2019 Hanoi summit with President Trump, Kim Jong-un reverted to hostile policy toward South Korea and the United States, mainly focusing on completing his nuclear program and rejecting any offer of dialogue. In addition, the recent revival of the military alliance between Russia and North Korea, along with North Korea's provision of ammunition to Russia, has further complicated and internationalized the North Korean threat. This has made the link between European security and Korean security more evident. What worries South Koreans the most nowadays is the possibility of Russia providing North Korea with highly sensitive military technologies, which could shift the military balance in favor of North Korea. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Minister, for such a tour de force. I think that was also, if I may, a very structured and a very academic overview of the relationship and how it has evolved historically, but also towards the end of the main drivers behind the ROK's evolving foreign policy strategy. So a lot for us to chew on, and we'll be returning to some of those, to some of the points that you raised. Let's now maybe turn over to Elena for a reflection on the impact of the war in Ukraine, on Europe's ambition to step up its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So how much bandwidth does Europe have now, given that the neighborhood is on fire, so to speak? And perhaps also, if you have time, on how the current crisis in the Middle East may also impinge on European security dynamics and EU ROK dynamics. Elena, welcome.
Thank you very much, Luis. Good morning to everyone. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be part of this distinguished panel of speakers, and I really enjoyed listening to you, Minister, and I think, you know, there's something to be said about those government officials who have also, members who have also been think tankers and academics. It's really there to see. So thank you very much. I will start by saying a couple of caveats. I will not profess to be an expert on Korea or on the Indo-Pacific, so what I say here will really be on the EU side of things, as someone who has been studying EU foreign policy and security policy for a number of years and from a number of regions, including in Latin America. There are many in here who are very much experts on Korea and EU-Korea relations, including my colleague in the back, Ulrich. And the second is I will speak as this expert and not representing any views of the European Parliament, so really my reflections on the topics here. I also have to say that a number of us who are in this room today found themselves last year on October 7th, so a year and 2 days ago, in an airport, at Brussels airport, on our way to Korea. And as our flight was delayed and we were sent back home only to return later, we witnessed on television the terrorist attacks of Hamas on Israel, the atrocious scenes that were seen there. And I remember as we were flying from Brussels to Seoul via Tokyo later on, I thought, this is a very important day, and I will remember for my whole life that on this day I was flying to Korea for the first time. And indeed, I think had we gone a week earlier, we would have found a very different tone in the meetings we had. And I'm saying this because it's Korea, and at times, those theaters are considered to be disengaged, the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, Ukraine. But indeed, how much we discussed Iran that day, for example, that week with Korean officials and think tankers, I think speaks to the interconnectivity that has been mentioned. And I really wanted to say this here because it really is a significant date. Now, I'll reply to Luis's question, but I also wanted to take a step back because I would like to sort of outline some trends in EU foreign and security policy that I would think precede Russia's war on Ukraine, and I think already gave a momentum for the EU to cooperate more with Korea as part of a group of what is now referred to generally as like-minded democracies in the Indo-Pacific. Because we should remember that the Indo-Pacific strategy was adopted by the EU in 2021, so this precedes Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we should also remember that, as the minister has highlighted, there is a long-standing cooperation in security between the EU and Korea in different stages, in different ways, and in different nuances. So if one thinks that the EU in the last 10 years has gone in its foreign and security policy, and particularly in the area of defense, from crisis management to then strategic autonomy, I would say, from the Global Strategy 2016, the feared rift in transatlantic relations, and I would say following 2022 into an approach of defense and potentially deterrence, I would argue that throughout all these times, the logic to engage with Korea has been there. And I think this is important to remember. If we think of, the last 10, 20 years in 3 phases in EU security and defense, I think in all these phases, it has been a partner. In crisis management, I think we're all aware of the framework participation agreements, participation in maritime operation Atalanta. Very important as well these days when we think about, what Africa represents, what East Africa represents, the maritime dimension really there. And then on the strategic autonomy front, which starts bringing in trade and economic security dimensions and hybrid dimensions to the EU's approach in security and defense. There it's again, and then defense and deterrence today. I'm saying deterrence not in the NATO nuclear way, but in the sort of conventional deterrence way. In all the discussions, again, we see on defense definitely cooperation in industrial defense issues and potentially moving forward. And then the return of deterrence, I would say, also creates open spaces for discussions about nuclear issues. And it's interesting that Commission President von der Leyen has mentioned nuclear a couple of times later, and I think a few years ago you would never hear that from the Commission. So of course that creates again a space for cooperation. So I just want to say that sort of normatively, I think it's not just the war in Ukraine. I think the EU's foreign and development and emancipation as a security and defense actor has always had space for Korea to be part of it, and in these 3 phases. But if we want to really focus on the last, I would say 2 years, which is a good coincidence. I mean, it's a very bad coincidence because we've had war on the EU's borders, but it's a coincidence between, on the one hand, having this new geopolitical environment, I would say unprecedented and unforeseen at the scale that it is. I mean, if you look at foresight reports from the past, there is always the fear of Russia's returning aggression, but not at the scale, and I would say at the length of time that we have been experiencing this. But there's also, the EU's very strategic focus on security and defense with the adoption of 2022 of the strategic compass, and therein we have a good framework to look at, how that explains cooperation with Korea. So we have the war, and we have the strategic approach of the EU through the compass. So honing in a bit onto the strategic compass, because I'm going to use it a bit as a guideline to see where Korea fits in. Well, the first part of the strategic compass, I imagine all of you in the room know, but it is a strategic document was adopted in 2022, sort of to guide EU security and defense policy and taking into account Russia's war on Ukraine. So I would say operationally, first of all, and this ties in with strategic autonomy, I think operationally the EU is at the moment when the breadth and scale of operations, is now going beyond crisis management. It's about training personnel and really boosting this operational and crisis management side that the EU decided to do with its strategic compass, also links up to the partnering part, and there Korea has been a partner, and it also opens up in linking with the Indo-Pacific strategy, where, by the way, Korea is mentioned 14 times, I think more than any other countries. It links up to the idea that by expanding operations, also by giving a big boost to maritime operations, and if we look now, which are the seas where we have these maritime operations, I think there's a gradual shift from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and Indo-Pacific, so obviously, I think the relationship there is very clear. So there is that operational part, which is, at the moment, I think the focus is more on the maritime, and it has to do with joint interests as well, like securing maritime trade, maritime situational awareness, preventing piracy, etc. Even blocking the access between Iran and other proxy actors of it. But I think, in the long term, because it's good to look at the long term, I think it also expands the space for cooperation in peacekeeping operations. And the minister mentioned Africa as a space of cooperation and development, but I think, that is also a space for cooperation in peacekeeping. When we look at the tech dimension of it, and I say tech, but this is actually the investing in industry dimension, but I think, that is also a space where the EU has really boosted its presence, its policy in defense, and we have seen unprecedented developments, such as the funding from the EU budget, not only of defense research and innovation, but also joint procurement, or seed money for joint procurement, seed money for joint production of ammunition, obviously linked to Ukraine because of the operation of the peace facility, the delivery of ammunition and missile support systems for support. And I think that has definitely opened space for cooperation more than before, because not only are the facts on the table that indeed there is between EU member states bilateral cooperation with Korea to procure and assets, that capabilities that are then delivered to Ukraine. But I think it's also opening up the space for jointly exploring, and I think we'll see that in the future, competitiveness in defense innovation, because I think this is also something I want to look forward to. But we have a new commission coming up. It's very much about competitiveness, and competitiveness is very much about research and innovation, and these discussions have been part of some of the dialogues with Korea. I don't have a watch because it's died, so do tell me when I used to have a nice old-fashioned watch and it told me what time it is, but now this one dies. Okay. And of course, some examples have been mentioned here about defense industrial cooperation, and I think we're all following the various contracts that are being negotiated, but also, interestingly, third country participation in EU defense initiatives also has been linked in with various criteria, but also it has to do with a shared value approach, which we kind of forget, but it isn't there, and I think this is an important element to remember. Then we go to the securing of the compass, which is essentially everything about hybrid threats. And I think this is very important because we've moved to now we say there's 6 domains of warfare. So so that's space, maritime, space, cyber, and so we have maritime, space, air. Now I lost cyber. 5 land. No, the traditional ones plus cyber and space, but the 6th one, yes, cognitive. I forgot. So cognitive. So I think the expansion of the domains of cooperation, of warfare, which is part of this hybridization of threats, is opening up this space for debate and cooperation. Also because, it seems to me, and I don't know Korea so well, but this kind of total defense, civil defense approach is very much part of Korea's DNA, and I think increasingly we're looking in European societies also at that. So resilience to disinformation, sort of preparedness, economic security, ensuring ability of states to continue functioning in the case of any type of attack. And I think, again, this is a Ukraine effect because we have seen the need for total defense in Ukraine, and I think it fits very well in with this hybridization of threats, which is this securing. So, and this in a way, opens up a bigger space, which is the link between economic security and conventional security. And I would say that, for example, the digital partnership agreements cannot be seen as security focused, but really when these kind of agreements that ensure sort of agreements on the standardization of digital is very much a part of being able to cooperate more on this kind of hybrid responses, especially to digital and cyber warfare. But also that, I think, in itself entails in it the whole discussion about economic security, which I think, of course, I know it's the next panel's discussion, but it is, economic security is part of this sort of securing approach of the strategic compass. It's not possible to do it without ensuring supply chain resilience, without a degree of autonomy in critical raw materials, without an effective sanctions regime. And all of this is, of course, something that I think we've seen in discussions, and consultations with Korea. The minister mentioned we have many, 40 going on, but also when we look at the chips issues, the battery issues, and this is all part and parcel of also security, including because they are non-negotiably important materials for defense industrial things. And finally, I think the evident one, which is the partnering. So obviously, an emphasis by the EU on partnering in security and defense is an impetus for more cooperation. And I think Russia's war in Ukraine, because you asked, Luis, has made it even more important that for all the ways in which the EU has responded to the war, partnering is essential. EU-NATO cooperation, I won't go into detail, but for supplying Ukraine with support on ammunition, for enforcing sanctions, for enforcing the non-circumvention of sanctions, for financial support, but also, and I finish here, to link up to the point on the axis of Iran, North Korea, Russia, China, it has become an essential component of the EU achieving its interest in the war in Ukraine. And I think cooperation, and that is linking the theaters and the interests of the two countries more than ever, and I'm sure we'll get back to that later on.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, we all know about the compass. I mean, how do you dare to ask that question? So no, that was really great. Thanks for.
Sorry, I just say that I'm not sure if I was Korean that I would know about the compass. And
No,
because
I was kidding.
And the reason is because I'm European, and I have to admit I don't know about the equivalent Korean.
I think you're probably the only one who knows about it. Well, you and a few others. No, but that was great, and actually, I sensed a lot of common themes in how you described the evolution of the EU's foreign policy outlook and how the minister described Korea's, right? With a first sort of focus on economic and trade. Then you mentioned crisis management. The minister mentioned like dealing with global problems, transnational problems. And now we're sort of seem to be both trending towards a more sort of strategic focus on interstate competition, deterrence, and so on. And I think that's a good sign in the sense that we are in a similar, and we have sort of always been or coherently been in a similar mental space in terms of how we think about foreign policy. So I think you've now sort of both laid the foundations of the ROK and the EU's sort of foreign policy visions. And I think now we're going to sort of move to a second segment in which we try to think about more concrete avenues for cooperation when it comes to the bilateral relationships. So we're going to turn over now to Seok Sang-hoon for an assessment of the EU-Korea cooperation, but perhaps zooming in on more concrete areas. Like, for instance, I know you've been working recently on defense industrial cooperation or cybersecurity. So it'd be great if you could tell us more about what we should be thinking about going forward.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair, for your kind introduction. Good morning. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here in Brussels. As it is so obviously and clearly has been discussed in this forum this morning already, the security of the two regions has been so closely intertwined, and nobody, I think, in this room would deny that statement, and most of us would agree to that statement. However, when it comes to slightly other policy communities of governments, academia, and think tanks, I think there are still so many people asking, why do we have to work with someone so far away? And I think that's a really important question and natural one. because geographical distance is such a huge challenge by itself. What seems to be happening on the other side of the world may not be felt as imminent or urgent as something that is happening at my own doorstep. And even within policy communities, we people still ask whether we have the capacity and willingness to project our power in times of need. And when it comes to cross-regional cooperation, there are so many actors involved. So sometimes, even among like-minded partners, it is not the easiest thing to come up with a common ground, especially when it comes to sensitive geopolitical issues. I think overcoming these challenges is really important in ensuring the long-term sustainability of our defense and security cooperation, because this is an area where the highest commitment and confidence is required. Without a strong belief that we are bound together, the momentum of our cooperation can be weakened or even be lost at any point. The challenge here is that such a strong identity is not something that can be forged just overnight. And that's the reason why I think it is important to set that as a long-term vision of our cooperation while continuing our cooperation in practical areas such as cyber security and defense industrial cooperation and even multilateral cooperation. In that context, cybersecurity has been making a particular success in recent years, defying the tyranny of the geographical distance. And basically, I think it is important that we build upon the good momentum that is generated by excellent platforms like the ROK EU High-Level Security Conference or the ROK OSCE Interregional Conference, as well as various and numerous bilateral consultative bodies that we have with individual European partners. Also notable is South Korea's participation in the Center of Excellence in NATO's Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and subsequent joining of the cyber drills such as Cyber Coalition and Locked Shields. Another promising area, I think, is defense industrial cooperation. In this area, South Korea has been surging recently, and now it is targeting to become the world's fourth largest defense exporter by 2027. And that is not unrelated to the situation in Europe. As it was previously mentioned by our chair, the NATO member states like Poland and Romania have purchased various fire platforms from South Korea, ranging from main battle tanks to jet fighters. And now we are even moving on to the next level of cooperation, encapsulating joint production, technology transfer, and training of people and engineers. The thing is that the rapid rise of South Korea as a defense industrial player has made it seen as a serious competitor for some countries. And I think it is important that we try to see each other as partners than competitors. And we can, because as a starter, for instance, South Korean and European countries can explore the possibilities of tapping into a broader world market. According to the Sweden-based think tank SIPRI, last year, the total defense spending in the world globally was about $2,400 billion US. Among them, 41% was spent in the Americas, 24% in Asia Pacific and Europe, and 9% in the Middle East, but it's growing. These numbers highlight potential opportunities lying ahead if we were to cooperate. And also, in the recent EU competitiveness report, President Draghi has pointed out that EU excels in the R&D capacity, but sometimes it finds it not so easy to fully industrialize those opportunities. So I think if we can combine those time-long experiences of the European countries in the defense industrial sector and excellent R&D capacity with South Korea's strong defense industrial capacity, then we can make a difference. And the next section of cooperation within the defense industrial sector, I think, is building more resilient supply chain for arms and ammunition production. When we see each other as competitors, sometimes it is because we focus only on end product. But when it comes to the actual products like ammunition, even simple items such as ammunition has many parts and materials that are required for its production. For instance, metal casings, explosives, and propellants. And when it comes to more complicated fire platforms, it is certainly more so. So when we try to see different stages of production and different parts and materials, then absolutely there is a greater space for cooperation for the European and South Korean companies. Last but not least, within the defense industrial cooperation, I think it is also important that we further our cooperation in the logistical sector. The war in Ukraine has shown that no single country alone can easily sustain modern warfare for a prolonged period of time, because each side has been reportedly spending 200 to 300,000 artillery shells per month. And in the new EU Defense Commissioner recently has emphasized the importance of securing adequate supply of arms and ammunition, and I think it can be a more efficient way to do this together. For instance, pre-allocating the resources that are required for the production, management, and supply of ammunition in times of need, while kickstarting more serious discussions about the standardization of various ammunitions that we use, then it can be a more efficient way to use our limited resources while achieving the goal of enhancing our operational sustainability and conventional deterrence. And lastly, when it comes to the divergence of threat perceptions and interests, I think it is important that we utilize various minilateral platforms. For instance, South Korea can explore the possibilities of joining additional center of excellence, because as Elena said, maritime security and other sectors like energy security or CBRN, chemical, biological, or radiological nuclear defense, they are all very relevant to South Korea's agenda. So I think in a nutshell, it is important that we try to form a long-term identity while accumulating successful experiences of cooperation in these three pillars. And also it is important that we continue to raise our public awareness and have opportunities like this to promote exchanges of thoughts and ideas and raise public awareness as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for your attention.
No, excellent. Thank you. And it seems we have a sort of common thread here, in the sense that the war in Ukraine may be animating or spurring greater cooperation, but the foundations for EU-Korea cooperation lay a lot deeper than that. They're much more structural. You alluded to that shared security identity, which is sort of, I think, very, very nicely illustrated by the fact that we've gone through similar motions in terms of how our foreign policy outlook has adapted to a dynamic geopolitical context, like going back to the various phases that both the Minister and Elena were mentioning. And thanks indeed for also putting some meat on the bone of defense industrial and cyber cooperation. Ramon, so as we were mentioning earlier, this month sort of marks the 7th anniversary since we launched our very dear Korea Chair at CSDS. And I think both the Minister and Elena already gave us a sort of 10,000 feet take on EU and ROK foreign policy priorities and outlook. But so more concretely, how do you think that the relationship between the two has evolved over the last 7 years since we established the chair, and perhaps relatedly, how much of it can be attributed to the establishment of our chair? No, but more seriously, and what do you think are the main challenges and opportunities going forward?
Thank you, Luis. You're right? 7 years ago, we launched the chair. We launched the forum 4 years ago. And if we go back in time, we're really focusing quite substantially on North Korea back then, if you recall, right? There was a lot of focus on what can Europe contribute to what back then seemed to be a rapprochement process between the two Koreas, and especially between the US and North Korea. We held one event just by chance on the day of the Singapore summit, right? So it was Singapore in the afternoon, it was morning time here in Brussels, and the statement came out as we were having the event. I remember this very, very vividly. And now, today, we don't even have a panel on North Korea. We might mention it a couple of times in this panel. It will come up. But I think this shows how the relationship has significantly changed. We're going to have a panel not on trade, but on economic security, and that also tells you the change that we have seen, because we have always focused on trade, but now we have to talk about broader economic dynamics taking place between the two countries. Even going back in time, I met Minister Yun for the first time in 2008. I was doing my PhD, so he was kind enough to do an interview with me. And Ambassador Castillo was posted in Seoul back then, also in 2008. And I asked both of them, I went through my notes to make sure I remember correctly, about EU-Korea cooperation. And back then it was EU. We're not talking about Europe. We're not talking about NATO. It was really the European Union. And it was trade, basically. Trade, investment, and that was it. And today we're talking about many other issues in which there is cooperation taking place. I would say that, first of all, the foundations are very solid. And I think this is a long-term relationship between Europe today, not only the European Union, we also have to include NATO, we also have to include European countries. So over the past year, we have had events in places such as France, UK, Spain. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Slovenia, and you see how different European countries are actually focusing on cooperation with Korea on a host of different matters. Next year we go to Poland, for example, right? And this goes way beyond economics. And why are these foundations so solid? Some of the reasons have been mentioned. I agree with the point about obviously shared interests, shared goals, values that do matter as well. But also I would argue that capabilities matter, right? When we are here in Europe and we look at partners across the world, there are very few partners that actually have strong capabilities, economic capabilities, military capabilities, and Korea has them, but also from a Korean perspective, right? When Korea is looking for partners across the globe with its global initiatives, there are really few countries, few regions with which it shared all these values, all these interests, but also are capable enough to have a partnership with Korea in which both of them are equal, right? You are not supporting another party, but you actually have this equal relationship. So I think that matters hugely. And I think we also have to focus on it was mentioned actually by Mr. Yun, right, on the US-China factor. Because I think we have mentioned the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously very important. But I also remember very vividly when President Trump came to office in the US. And here in Europe, we're looking for partners, but Korea was doing the same, right? And I would say more Korea than Europe, actually, really started to look at Europe as a partner that goes beyond economics only, right? And in which areas can we cooperate together? So back then, there was this focus on how can we maintain global governance, right? We have moved beyond that paradigm a little bit, because we have seen how the US, and not only China and other countries, have a different view of global governance than the one we have here in Europe or in Korea, right? But we also have to mention this, right? That this rivalry between the US and China, which whoever wins the election in 1 month, right? In 1 month we have the election in the US. I think will continue. And Elena mentioned, for example, the security and defense partnership, I think, right? That's also going to be crucial. So I think as the European Union has become more geopolitical, European countries have looked beyond the neighborhood, and we see NATO's growing ties with the IP4, as we call them now, right? From AP4 to IP4, but Korea being one of them. We see the foundations for this long-term partnership. And I will add a couple of points that I've seen coming up in discussions, as I said, that we had over the past 12 to 18 months in different European capitals, in Korea as well, but also in the US. We have seen this growth in minilaterals that you all know about, right? So if we focus on NATO IP4, which I just mentioned, of course, but we have the Camp David trilateral between Korea, Japan, and the US emerging. We have AUKUS, which of course is sensitive for many Europeans, but some other Europeans see it in a different light. We see this discussion about potentially having a G7+ that would include Korea, Australia as well. I think we're moving towards this minilaterals that complement the bilateral relationships that we have, and relationships in plural that we have between different European actors and Korea. And we see this cooperation, these minilateral platforms, and I think you mentioned this, Luis, right? With the Brilliant Allies project, we go to Korea. Actually, on Monday we're in Korea, right? I think so. So very soon we'll be there discussing NATO-Korea cooperation with our Korean partners. So you see this move towards these minilaterals, and I think that's going to become even stronger as time goes by. Big caveat, of course, being we see what happens in the U.S. election, because some candidates, right, are less fond of partnerships than others. But I think even if Trump wins, I think the trilateral, for example, I think will survive. Korea, Japan, US. I think NATO AP4 will continue. We shouldn't forget that actually Trump invited Korea to the G7 summit that then was canceled because of the pandemic. So I think these minilaterals will continue, right? And they will involve Europe, they will involve Korea, US, Japan, other countries, Australia. Canada, of course, is very involved in them, and I think we should pay attention to those, because I think from us here in Europe is a very good way to get involved in security, broadly understood, including economic security issues in Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, in a way that at a bilateral level may be a little bit more difficult for us. And just as a way of conclusion, I think that this stronger partnership is going to become a feature of South Korea Europe relations, and I think mentioning Europe is adequate. And I give one example to emphasize this. Luis and I, we come from Spain. It is fair to say that Spain is maybe one of the countries that historically has paid limited attention to Asia, Indo-Pacific region, Asia, right? But a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, even Spain and Korea signed a bilateral partnership that covers not only economics, but covers security, covers diplomacy, covers all these different aspects, right? So you even see European countries, and I use Spain as an example, so not to offend other European countries here, right? So I will offend my own country, are looking at Korea as a partner with which we have to work with, and are putting meat on the bone. So now in the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, we have one official whose job is basically to cover the relationship with Korea. A development unthinkable, I would say, 3, 4, 5 years ago, but now you see many different European countries. So I think the foundations are very strong, and the partnership will continue for a long time, that this is not a short-term issue related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you, Ramon, for such an excellent, much more micro overview of how the Europe-Korea relationship has evolved in the last 7 years or so, and how it is evolving today. Okay, so I think we've got about half an hour-ish, give or take, given that we started early. So we've got 30 to 35 minutes. We're going to open this up. So any questions, comments you may have, please raise your hands, state your name and affiliation. Try to keep it to one question, so no long statements. And please do specify who you are addressing. I got one here and another one there. 3. Let's take 3 at a time, okay? Please. Well, it's okay. You'll be the second.
Thank you for distinguished panelists for your excellent remarks. Anna Lee from DG TAXUD of the European Commission. My question goes to Korean fellow Mr. Yoon. As our chair Ramon mentioned, the ROK's partnership with NATO is quite new for all of us. If I'm not mistaken, since the last year's agreement on the ITPP between NATO and ROK, both parties tried to promote practical cooperation in line with defense industry, as you mentioned, the cyber security, as well as the NATO's nuclear deterrence, etc. In that respect, I would be grateful to hear a bit more of your opinion, how this attempt shall bring a positive influence, impact on the ROK's relationship, not only with NATO, but also with other neighboring countries in the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. We've got Edward, two more here.
Thank you. Edward Howell from the University of Oxford and a fellow at Chatham House. I've got a question for Minister Yoon and also for Ramon. It's the same question, so no monologues. We've seen South Korea try and move from being a contributor to security to a provider of security, at least in rhetoric. After Russia and North Korea signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty in June, the South Korean government said that a red line had been crossed. What will it take for South Korea to provide active assistance, military assistance, to Ukraine?
All right, thank you for that. Such an easy question.
Thank you very much. I'm Ben Snamet from King's College London, and my question would go to Elena, Ramon, and maybe to Luis as well. That it was mentioned several times that South Korea has defense industrial capacities. Elena mentioned that we can learn from the total defense of South Korea. So it is always my kind of pitch to many people that yes, South Korea has, compared to European countries, much larger capacities to do military exercises, much larger military. And their military is as large as UK, France, Germany combined, and so on. So I'm just curious about your perceptions. Is it something that in EU capitals and in Brussels are well known? There is an awareness of that? Because in the UK there is a growing awareness, but a slow awareness of this. I'm just curious if this really is a widespread or a growing awareness that we should go and learn from South Korea how to do things that it might be relevant in a total defense or a defense industrial capacity building up situation. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks. So we've got a question on can we learn how to do things from South Korea when it comes to total defense? Another one on active assistance to Ukraine, and then the other one on IPTPP. And I'm going to abuse my position and throw in a question there. And I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to go in reverse order this time, okay? So we're going to start with Ramon and then work our way to the minister. And then we'll have, I'm sure there will be time for one or two more rounds at least. Just wanted to follow up on Ramon's points about the U.S. election and throw a question out there for the panel, but perhaps more specifically for Elena and for the minister. What do you think are the implications of Trump 2 scenario for European and ROK security, respectively? Ramon?
Thank you. I'll start with the easy question then, and I'll move to the complicated question. I think so. I would also say, and this applies to you, I think Central Eastern Europe, the countries that are closer to Russia and Ukraine, are very aware of this. That's my impression. That's my impression from discussions we are having with countries in the region and the way they reach out to discuss very specific issues about how Korea organizes its defense industry, including a point I think, Lena, you mentioned it, resilience, issues like societal resilience, right? Where I personally think that Korea is behind Europe, or maybe none of them is very advanced, right? But I do think so. Tomorrow we have an event in Paris, and this is going to be discussed there, right, specifically. So I think even in Western Europe, we are starting to see this as an example of something we could look into. And what I find interesting is that some of the questions you get are very specific that go beyond my level of knowledge about how Korea organizes its defense industry, right? The role of the different firms, the different ministries, the different departments, right? The military, of course, right? So there are those who really study in detail every single actor in the ecosystem that Korea has in the defense industry. Of course, the relationship with the US, how does this fit with developments in Korea? What Korea learned from Russia or got from Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Korea was acquiring technology and expertise from Russia, for example. So you get those type of questions as well, right? Like historical development as well, not only the relationship with the US, but with other countries with which today you may even have an antagonistic relationship. So the answer here would be yes, I would say so. On the question of Ukraine, my answer would be that I think we're not going to see a change in position, because there is no demand on Korea to change its position from the countries that matter to Korea, because weapons are making their way to Ukraine via third countries, right? And this is known, right? So you don't see the US asking Korea, and that matters hugely for Korea, obviously, who is asking the question, and if the US is not asking, that carries weight, right? Among other things, because the US likes this position of being an intermediary, so to speak, between Korea and Ukraine, so it's comfortable with this position. I think Poland is not asking this question either. I think Poland also likes the fact that it is a huge contributor to Ukraine, including Korean technology, weapons making their way through Poland. So there has been this change. It was interesting. I think, and I know you go to Korea often, right? If you were in Korea a year ago, yeah, this question was still being asked, right? It was still being asked. Frankly speaking, over the past 6-9 months, when you go to Korea, this question is not being raised because we have settled in this position. Okay, we'll go through third parties. The other point that has to be said, and this touches on Luis's question, that in like many other countries, what happens if Trump wins and tells Ukraine, you sit down with Russia and reach an agreement? So Koreans are thinking this, saying, why would they transfer directly to Ukraine when Ukraine may be forced in a month or 2 months to settle with Russia? It doesn't really make sense. It might be different if the war continues for 1 or 2 years. The other point that I would add, there are many in Korea who would want the direct transfer of weapons, because they say, well, if our weapons are making their way to Ukraine, why don't we take the credit of directly transferring to Ukraine? We have poor relations with Russia anyway, right? I'm not saying everyone in Korea shares this view, but that those in Korea, and they have written op-eds, and they go on TV channels, and they you know, SBS, KBS, they interview and say, we should just do it, you know, because really we're going to get the credit, political credit, diplomatic credit, that we are not getting for not doing it. So there's also this debate in Korea, which I find interesting myself.
Excellent. Thanks, Ramon. Sang-Hoon?
Thank you. Regarding the question about the NATO ITPP, I think it is really a kind of integral form of cooperation that has been really engine the cooperation between NATO and South Korea. And unlike the previous form of cooperation, it is even more meaningful in that it is setting concrete timeline and tasks and those things to be achieved. The thing is that I think we still have some room for improvements because, for instance, on an area like maritime security is not included in the ROK NATO ITPP, which is interesting, unlike with Japan's. And also, it is important that we have greater public awareness about what we are doing through the ITPP, because it is not so well known to the Korean public. So I think it is important and meaningful to see a development like SCIWA on the internet. I read a lot of their postings on the LinkedIn and Facebook about what South Korea and other Asian countries are doing with European countries. And also, it is important that although we do have ITPP with NATO, it is important that we continue to build multiple layers of cooperation so that institutionalization of our cooperation can be even more strengthened. So joining additional center of excellence can be one thing. And when it comes to NATO IP4 cooperation as well, it is important that those IP4 countries are also interconnected in its relationship with NATO. So maybe we can think about coming up with policy dialogue forums that can be somehow inspired or similar to the Mediterranean dialogue or Partnership for Peace. And it is also important that we formalize and officialize those invitations to IP4 countries in the coming years. I hope this answers your question.
Excellent, thanks for that. And there are some NATO colleagues in the room, so feel free to come in later if you want to. Elena.
Yes, thank you. First, to clarify to the question about, about the total defense, two clarification. I did not say that you should learn from Korea or the other way around. I would not profess to say so because one of the two actors I do not know that well, as I said. But what I did say is I think that it opens up space for consultation, for exchange of practices. And the reason I say this is that my understanding is that the way the threat environment looks to both the Republic of Korea and to the EU shares a lot of similarities. And those similarities in the threat assessment mean that both in the area of conventional defense and civil defense, which make up total defense, there is a lot to explore together in the consultations and in future potential formats, be that security and defense enhanced dialogues or economic security dialogues. And what I specifically was thinking at the moment and honing in on is this societal resilience, which Ramon mentioned, perhaps needs space to develop further in both areas, and because it has increasingly become evident, and I think the war on Ukraine has evidenced that disinformation, energy weaponization, cyber attacks which have the capacity to paralyze the functioning of government. These kind of issues which make part of this integrated defense approach, I think this is a lot of space for cooperation between the two, not to mention also the maritime security, which in itself brings other dimensions of defense with it, which are not, again, it's not just about piracy or attacks, it's also about space satellite communications, it's about resilient systems of maritime situational awareness. So I think on all these spectrums, we have that potential, and I think you asked if it's a discussion being had. I would say, I think for the majority of the world, these discussions are being had simply by the fact that there are so many formats now of exchange, and there is really a boosted emphasis on defense. On Trump, I'm always very hesitant to say, because I think it's very unpredictable, and what we can go on, obviously, one thing is what Ramon talked about he said he would immediately end the war, but I think more importantly is the China factor, and I think really the China factor and the way he deals with China would be affecting these kind of conversations.
I love it how you react to the Trump question the same way I do. It's just too unpredictable to answer. Minister.
Thank you. Let me try to answer Dr. Howard's question about South Korea's contribution to Ukraine war, right? I think South Korean government has been providing humanitarian aid as well as military aid, except providing lethal weapons. I think provision of lethal weapons is a much more complicated issue because of the unique Korean security situation caused by North Korean threat. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un declared that North Korea would complete 5 strategic weapons tasks by 2026. And these 5 tasks includes solid fuel ICBMs and hypersonic missiles, multi-warhead guidance technology, nuclear-powered submarines, and reconnaissance satellites. Each one of these weapons is critical in terms of changing military balance in South Korea. And the situation nowadays is that the Russian leader has been implicitly threatening South Korea that he would provide this kind of technology to North Korea if South Korea provides lethal weapons to Ukraine. And South Korean foreign minister recently responded to that kind of implicit threat by saying that if you provide North Korea with highly sensitive military technologies, we will aid Ukraine with these lethal weapons or something like that. So it's a kind of a very delicate situation. And I think we had better understand this unique Korean situation. Regarding Trump's possible election in the coming U.S. presidential election in less than a month, I think there is, upsides and downsides of his election from South Korean perspective. One upside is that the current tension between two Koreas will be able to be reduced to some extent by resuming dialogue between the United States and North Korea. And that's a good thing for us. I mean, the downside or the risk factor is that what will South Koreans do if President Trump concludes a kind of sloppy agreement, which mainly focuses on removing ICBMs? And North Korea would, may probably freeze their nuclear operation and demand total removal or lifting of economic sanctions. And President Trump may be able to declare that his diplomacy succeeded in removing North Korea's threat toward the United States. But still, South Korea and Japan will continue to be exposed to the threat of North Korea through short-term missiles, short-range missiles, and medium-range missiles, conventional as well as nuclear threats. So it's a kind of big dilemma. That's the problem. And its impact, President Trump's re-election, impact of that on South Korea-Europe relations is basically if he's elected and pursues isolationist policy, which will weaken alliance relationship and weaken the rules-based international order, South Korean leaders and European leaders will consider seriously what they will do. Will they do nothing in that kind of very critical situation, or try to strengthen bilateral relationship and try to uphold a rules-based international order or not? So I think his election may justify strengthening further our relationship in coming years. Thank you.
Well, excellent. Thank you, Minister, for those very interesting observations on the implications, both for Korea itself and for the relationship. If I may say something briefly on the learning thing, I was saying earlier that Korea is actually far ahead in the game when it comes to thinking about cross-theater cooperation, whether in a NATO IP4 context and beyond. And I wasn't saying that because this is a Korea forum and you need to say nice things about Korea. That too, but I meant it. And here, I think the defense industrial file, so beyond total defense, which I think is a very good point, I think Korea has now showed us a way in which also, if you reverse engineer the situation, in which Europeans could actually provide a meaningful strategic contribution in a first island chain or Korean Peninsula contingency, right? Like supply the effort of frontline allies. So which is something that is, strategically far more meaningful, I think, than, a dialogue on cyber, as good as that is, or so on and so forth. So I think from that perspective, we can learn in the sense that it shows a very practical, concrete, and strategically meaningful way for Europeans to provide a constructive role in a contingency in the first island chain. We've got about 20 minutes or so left. So what I'm going to do, if you all allow me, is just collect a bunch of questions. You don't need to answer them all. And I'll give you like 3 minutes each for wrap-up statements. I got Reinhold few people in the back, the gentleman in the 6th, 7th row as well, 3rd. Let's just take them all. I mean, unless.
Thank you very much. My name is Reinhold Brender. I'm a former EU official and now with the Belgium's Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations. I have the observation, Minister, thank you very much for indeed highlighting the weakening of the international system, which is one of the key challenges which motivates our EU Republic of Korea cooperation in the domain of security. And the Ukraine war came, I would say, as a wake-up call to all of us to accelerate and intensify the cooperation. And we have seen a very good presentation here of the range of issues this entails. Now, my question is against the background also of what you said, Minister, the third phase where you basically said EU and Republic of Korea, and I think you're entirely right, they are working together also to address global issues. And this Ukraine situation is a very specific issue with a global impact. And here my question is, what possibilities do you see for the EU and the Republic of Korea beyond the necessary, very important cooperation on the defense, security, technological cooperation, and also economic security cooperation, to take a step back and also take a much more holistic approach towards the notion of security cooperation in the global sphere by working together in upholding the rules-based international order by engaging with the Global South also? That is my question. You mentioned development cooperation, and it's indeed, if my memory is correct, one of the formats of a dialogue. You said we have 40 formats of dialogue, it's true, and I think development cooperation is now included. Of course, it goes beyond development cooperation. What are the prospects you see for the EU and the Republic of Korea, and I think the question goes to all the panelists, to engage also more on issues of global governance reform, because that is really linked to the issue of peace and security. Because I just wanted to say it's true, we have almost 2,500 billion euro last year, the highest spending ever for military expenses, but we have a financing gap, for example, on the Sustainable Development Goals this year of 4,000 billion euro. And if a little bit of the spending, of the military spending could go to development, this could be a very important contribution to peace and security.
Excellent, thanks, Reinhold. Please, the gentleman on the 1st row. And if we can stick to one question, I would appreciate that, thanks.
Peter Semneby, I'm the special envoy for the Korean Peninsula in the Swedish Foreign Ministry. I would like to ask Minister Yoon to take his argument or the scenario that he outlined after a possible victory by Donald Trump in the United States presidential election one step further. If a deal of the kind that you described will happen, how is that going to impact discussions in South Korea on developing its own nuclear weapons?
Nice question. Yeah, 3rd. We're going to try and take them all. If you can just be brief, we can take them all.
Thank you very much. My name is Jinwoo Kim. I am an international trade lawyer at a U.S. firm based in Brussels. So thank you very much for your panel this morning. So I want to bring international trade back to the picture of global security, if that's relevant, because Minister Yoon and also Ramon, I think, explained that at the very beginning of the cooperation between the EU and Korea was trade and investment. And my question is, how do you see the role of international trade in strengthening not only the EU-Korea relationship, but also the global security? And I will provide a bit of background of why I am asking this question, because what I've noticed in the past 6 years in the EU, more recently 2-3 years after the Ukraine war, is that EU actually see EU policy not only as a trade policy, but they also take into economic security element. So as you may have, you probably know, and I think this will be discussed in the second panel, so the Commission published the economic security package in January this year, which itself is not trade policy but concerns many. And also if we see the EU's anti-subsidy investigation against Chinese electric vehicle, it's actually purely trade measure, but there's also economic security element in the political scene. So that's the background of my question, and thank you very much.
Thanks. Can we get all the hands up so that I get a sense of how many we've got? Okay, if we can please stick to questions and ideally one, we will take them all. Yes.
Hello, Sergei Christa. I'm studying here at Brussels School of Governance. Just wanted to ask about the shadow fleet, and I think that's a question primarily to His Excellency the Ambassador, but maybe the other analytical minds would also add their own comments and insights. The shadow fleet, which brings Russian oil to China, and whether you could tell us anything, give us any insights between that and North Korea supplying its arms, whether there's any connection between that and North Korea being able to supply so many armaments to Russia. And what does it say about, not only about the ability of international community to police sanctions and international order, but also globalization of autocracies?
All right, thanks. In the back.
Thank you very much. Balkan Devlen, the MacDonald-Laurier Institute, Canada. A quick question on the submarine exports that Korea has been increasingly interested in the global markets. Canada is going to purchase new submarines. Korea is one of the stronger candidates for it. Poland is interested in purchasing South Korean submarines. This suggests an increasing cooperation on the defense component with NATO countries. Do you see this particularly the naval aspect, the submarine aspect, leading to further institutionalized coordination, cooperation, as well as interoperability with NATO forces and Korea down the road? Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for the great question, Pietro. And then we've got the gentleman here on the right.
Just very briefly, as you kindly suggest that we take the floor very rapidly. Pietro Matthijs, I'm responsible for Indo-Pacific engagement at NATO, PDD section. Just indeed responding to one of the points which was mentioned, indeed it is important that the public in Korea is understanding what actually is the scope of our cooperation with Korea. We're increasingly trying to engage with the stakeholders and partners in universities, including foundations in Korea. So we very much hope that we can further discuss about these issues also with the panelists later after this conversation. One question I would have as a floor would be if you could elaborate a bit more about the scope for cooperation between NATO, EU, and Korea in security and defense on a triangular opportunity possibly. Thanks.
All right, thank you for that. And then final question.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Ulrich Jochheim. I'm a colleague of Elena in the EPRS in the European Parliament. I think the most fascinating topic for me in Northeast Asia is the relationship between Korea and Taiwan. So I have a question to the two Korean panelists. Do you share what Luis was saying about the first island chain? Because in a certain way, if you look at the map, Taiwan is the core of the first island chain. And would Korean support go above what Luis was saying, which means to supply allies in case of a threat to the first island chain?
Excellent, thanks. That's a great bunch of questions. We've got, I think, 23 questions and 1 minute each. No, but really, you have about 3-4 minutes each. Obviously, you cannot answer every individual question. We're going to work our way again in reverse order. So, Minister, you will be closing. And just to recap, we've got what can the EU and Korea do together when it comes to the global South and global governance. Then we've got a question about your scenario, Trump, with that breakdown, implications for the domestic debate in Korea about nuclear weapons. Then we've got a question on trade, global security nexus. We've got oil, we've got submarines, we've got NATO, EU, Korea, and we've got Korea, Taiwan. Ramon.
Okay, I'll start with NATO, Korea, EU. So around 4 years ago when the relationship really started to, sorry, microphone, you're right.
NATO, Korea, EU. So around 4 years ago, when we started discussing Korea-EU security cooperation, it was very interesting because when you discuss this with the Korean counterparts, they would always bring in NATO, right? Especially if you went to the Ministry of Defense. I mean, I remember very very well a meeting I had with some of the Ministry of Defense on EU-Korea cooperation. And Director General, they only wanted to talk about NATO, and we ended up talking like an hour and a half, I think. It was like 45-minute meeting, went to an hour and a half. And now that Ambassador Castillo and the EU is allowed, for example, she's joining our event on NATO next week. She's allowed as an EU ambassador to discuss NATO in a Korean context. This is really facilitating discussions with the Korean side. Because one of the points that the Korean side always made is, well, we can discuss cooperation with the EU on the security field, of course, but the US factor is going to be there, right? And because the US is part of NATO, this makes it much easier. It is much more comfortable for Korea to be able to discuss cooperation with EU, with European Union member states, that most of them are also NATO member countries as well, right? So in that way, that's helping. It has to be said. And it allows for cooperation on a whole range of issues that with the EU would be a bit more difficult because we don't have the capabilities as EU, but NATO does have those capabilities. And the point, there was another question about the question directly about trade and investment and global security. We have the second panel, obviously, economic security. I'm a bit pessimistic in the nexus between good or not good, but economic relations leading to more security stability. I mean, and the clear example is China, obviously, with its relations. Many countries are having problems with them, even though China continues to be a very important trade partner for many countries. So I'm pessimistic in that sense, to be honest with you, but we'll have the second panel. And I find interesting the question about Taiwan, because next month, we're in October now, so in 2 months, in December, there is an event in Oxford or Cambridge, one of the two. I always get them confused. You're in Oxford, so in Cambridge. There's an event on Taiwan security, right? And they want to discuss, among other things, specifically South Korea's contribution to a Taiwan contingency. Right, it's one of the topics that Taiwanese government wants to discuss, and they bring people over from Taiwan. They might even from South Korea, obviously from Japan, from other countries as well, because they want to discuss this. And I say so because I think the discussion in private is very different from the discussion in public when it comes to Korea, Taiwan. It's day and night, basically, right? And when you reach out to the relevant people in Korea who are willing to discuss this, in MOFA, Ministry of Defense, I find very interesting that discussion. Which in public they would never acknowledge, I would say.
Thanks. So there are a lot of questions. So regarding firstly the shadow fleet, and I think it is important that we continue to add pressure to North Korea so that we can at least try to bring it back to the negotiating table. And in doing that, I think it is really important to cut off their oil supply, which is really taking place on the high seas illegally. Ship-to-ship transaction is one thing. And I think after the panel of experts at the UN Security Council has been dissolved due to the veto by Russia and China, it is important that we come up with a kind of complementing mechanism to implement our sanction system. And actually there is a system called Pacific Security Maritime Exchange that is a US-led kind of maritime security initiative that is joined by South Korea, Japan, as well as many European countries. And I think that is one way we can think of to use a mechanism like PSMX to complement the role of POE since it is gone. Regarding the Canadian submarine project, as I briefly mentioned during my presentation, I think it is a good way for the South Korean companies and some European companies to work together for tapping into a broader world market. Actually, there are some South Korean and UK companies working together to make joint bidding for the Canadian petrol submarine project, and I think this is a really excellent example. And since when you purchase a weapon system from such country, it's not one-time transaction because you need ammunition and you have to maintain and repair, and you also need to train your staff for the operation of that weapon system. So I think it definitely helps to institutionalize defense cooperation between partners. Regarding Taiwan, I think the discussions in South Korea have just begun in a more sincere manner, but it is related to the discussion also about what is South Korea's position between the US and China. So it is a very sensitive issue, and a lot of South Korean people, frankly speaking, I think still didn't really decide what we can do about it. But my personal thoughts is that South Korea is one of the key allies of the US, and it's an open economy, and the Taiwan Strait really is an important strategically accounting for more than 90% of Korea's energy supply line. So I think it's inseparable from South Korea's security, and we really need to discuss more seriously about what we can contribute for the stability of the Taiwan Strait. As a wrap-up comment, I think it is important. The reason why we really need to institutionalize our cooperation is because of the unpredictability and uncertainty that is rapidly rising, and we definitely want to see more cooperation between us like-minded partners like South Korea and Europe.
Excellent, thanks. I may add that I was just checking, we published the brief, a colleague of ours, Dong-Fei Kim, who couldn't be here today, who's working with Ramon in the Korea chair, published an excellent brief on the implications of a Taiwan contingency for the US ROK alliance. This was published in 2022. Yeah, so I think you will have a very good analysis there. Elena.
Yes, thank you. I'll take the first question because I'm really grateful it was asked, and I think it's very important to address this issue for a couple of reasons. I think the first is that, if we go back in the 2000s, the initial reason for more engagement between the EU and strategic partners, among them the democracies of the G20, was essentially to promote multilateralism, and that in its turn because there was a very clear understanding of a security, development, democracy, and nexus in a way. So all of it was linked. So peace, security, development was very much linked, and the idea was to promote that together in areas like Africa and South Asia as well. And it's mentioned by the minister that this happened between the EU and Korea. And essentially, we've done some studies at the EPRS, and these are actually the two areas where you have the most instability due to the lack actually of the SDGs. So all the reasons that can be behind instability and that are linked to the SDGs. And the second reason is because, we've just come out of the Summit for the Future. I think it's important not to forget that this is not just about, that development is never just about development, it's also about peace and security. There's SDG 16, but I think all the SDGs, whether it be food security, women, anything is linked to peace and security. And there's a lot that the EU can do with Korea on this. It also links up to the issue of Trump, because I think one thing we can say about Trump, based on previous experience, is that the multilateral agenda, but also the SDG agenda, the development agenda, may suffer. And if we look back to the first Trump administration, a huge decrease in overseas development assistance by the United States. It actually, several agencies were closed down. So, in that situation, others have to step up. So I think perhaps having a contingency for this situation where the United States is stepping back again and studying and essentially focusing on the instability that can be provoked by the lack of development cooperation, including sub-Saharan Africa. I think this is really an agenda to look at. And finally, because it's linked also to economic security, but also to this issue, I think it's also important to look at the new modalities of development cooperation, which go much beyond what was traditionally there, but also have to do with, resilient, digitally and sustainable connectivity, which have to do with infrastructure development. And I think all of this is also very much a link to the economic security agenda, to do this in a sustainable manner, in a manner that the financing is green. And that is, I would say, and this is from my Brazilian experience, a way to engage the so-called global South, because one thing that we see reverberating in Africa, in Latin America, and South Asia is a request for green financing to become more available, to be more for the international financial institutions and the multilateral development banks to really move towards that direction. And G20 have gravitas in this. So some of my thoughts on this.
Excellent, thanks. Minister, I believe there's quite a bit of stuff on your plate.
I will try. First, regarding developmental cooperation between EU and South Korea. Actually, President Yoon's administration increased ODA budget by 100% from 2021 to 2023, which indicates that there will be much more room for mutual cooperation with EU in providing developmental assistance in the global south. So I think this is a positive development in the recent few years. And as I mentioned, Yoon Suk-yeol administration has been ambitious in pursuing more proactive global role in international relations. And the second question was Trump's election and South Korea's developing nuclear weapons. Of course, this is one of the hottest topics in South Korea even nowadays. And about 70% of South Korean population supports South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. And there are pros and cons. Basically, professional analysts usually tended to have a kind of negative view on that view promoted by general public. But anyway, President Trump has been known as harboring the idea of withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea for almost 4 decades. He actually paid money to advertise his idea for New York Times about 30 years ago. Why should America, pay money for U.S. forces, Korea or Japan or something like that? So. Also, when I read Mark Esper's, former Secretary of Defense in the United States, his book told a story that he tried hard to persuade Donald Trump when he really pursued, policy of withdrawing American troops from South Korea in his first term. And he said he and Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, cooperate with each other and succeeded in persuading Donald Trump, saying, why don't we push that agenda in the next term, second term? So if President Trump is elected, there is some possibility that Trump may pursue the withdrawal of U.S. forces from South Korea. I don't know what will happen exactly, but there's a possibility. And if that extreme situation comes without providing any alternative institutional mechanism with which they can guarantee South Korean concerns for national security, I think every option should be on the table for South Koreans to discuss. So naturally, developing nuclear weapons will be one alternative. I don't know whether that kind of extreme situation will happen or not, but I sincerely hope not. But I think we cannot exclude that kind of possibility totally. The third question about Russia, China, North Korea trilateral relationship. Of course, those countries seem to be cooperating very closely. Russia provides oil to China, and North Korea provides ammunition to Russia or something like that. But I think their trilateral relationship is not that much strong as it looks, because fundamentally the Chinese strategy is maintaining status quo on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia, because any turbulence or difficult relations, things happens that will On the other hand, the goal of North Korea and Russia does not care as status quo on the Korean Peninsula. Russia's, the most important goal is winning the war. And North Korea's, goal is completing their nuclear weapons. And so there's a kind of gap between those two sides in terms of strategies. So I think we had better wait and see what will happen. Finally, regarding what we, South Korea and EU should do in terms of global governance or global South. I think it is important for both sides to cooperate in the existing multilateral mechanisms like United Nations, WTO, G20, etc. Because there seems to be declining U.S. influence and declining leadership, U.S. leadership. Of course, there may be some differences in the extent whether Trump will be elected or Harris will be elected. But even in the case Harris is elected, that kind of general trend seems to be there. So what we should do should be the most important discussion and cooperation for both sides, South Korea and the European Union. Whether we will leave it, just let it happen in that way without doing much, or whether we will try to fill the leadership vacuum left by American decline of American influence and gradual advance, big advance by the Chinese influence. We both, are democracies. We want multilateralism. We want rules-based international order. Then I think we have to act together, and we have to strengthen our cooperation in those multilateral mechanisms. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Minister. So I promised we would finish ahead of time. We didn't. But at least I hope you enjoyed this first session as much as I did. It was really terrific. There is no time for any final inspiring remarks from my side, so I'm going to spare you of that. But please do join me in thanking our speakers for an excellent session. And we'll resume in 15 minutes.
I'm going to examine one of the students in December or January. I examined like 3 of the students already. He always invites me because I know I'm easy, right? So I may see you there. Yeah. He met me twice. He met me a new one. So like, okay, constantly,